Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining another Outcomes for Me Ask the Expert webinar. Today, we are extremely grateful to be able to answer your questions around the latest research questions and misconceptions about clinical trials and some recently approved therapies in breast cancer care by bringing you a medical oncologist expert to answer the questions that we've gathered directly from our community. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, my name is Suzanne Garner, and I am Director of Marketing and Community at Outcomes for Me. I am also a stage 2 breast cancer survivor, and I joined the company after I found the app shortly after my own diagnosis, and I found it really helpful for being a safe and evidence-based place to educate myself on my diagnosis. For today's webinar, I am honored to welcome Dr. Teplinsky. Dr. Teplinsky is a board-certified medical oncologist specializing in breast and gynecological oncology. She is the head of breast and gynecological medicine at Valley Mount Sinai Comprehensive Cancer Center in Mount Sinai in New York. Her clinical and research interests focus on young women with breast cancer, survivorship, exercise oncology, and the use of social media in oncology. She's passionate about education and advocacy on social media. She has a wonderful presence on Instagram. I've been a long-term follower of hers there. And she is also the creator and the host of the Interlude podcast. The podcast provides support, inspiration, encouragement, hope. She interviews other experts and patient advocates. So definitely please check that out. Welcome, Dr. Teplinsky. Would you please start us off just by introducing yourself and maybe filling us in on anything that I may have missed?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here. I think there's always such a role for just going through some really key topics, and we're going to talk about clinical trials. We're going to talk about treatments. So I'm really excited, and feel free to, put any questions in. Yeah, and I think we should just get right into it.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm going to start. We got quite a few questions from our community, and we'll be looking in case anybody wants to ask a question live. You can enter that on the chat here as well. But I've grouped them into a couple of different categories, and so I think I'm going to start with the questions around clinical trials and understanding trials. So just to start a sort of a big umbrella question, one of the first questions that we got from our community is how exactly do clinical trials work, and what can I expect if I decide to participate in one?
All right, so we're gonna jump right in. It's a big question. So I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind about clinical trials. So clinical trials are done for a number of reasons. What we typically think in breast cancer and in oncology is, we're testing new treatments and testing, sometimes there's devices as well, but let's focus for today on treatments. And so thinking about, is the treatment better than the current standard of care? Does it answer a question we don't know the treatment about? Is it a new drug, or is it looking at side effects, and is it trying to improve on a toxicity or a quality of life issue? So the way a trial is designed, starting from all the way to beginning, the researchers will say, well, look, is there an unmet need? Is there a question? And can we develop a drug or to target a particular, maybe a mutated gene or a pathway that's expressed? And then the trial starts with that drug discovery. It moves into preclinical research, so typically in cell lines, sometimes in mice or rat studies, and then eventually moves its way into humans. And once it gets into humans, there's really kind of starting with phase 1, which are our first in human trials, small numbers of patients. And here we're really trying to figure out what is the dose that we can give safely, and what is the drug safe, and what can we expect when we give it in patients. Phase 2, we're starting to look at larger number of patients, efficacy, preliminary signs of efficacy. And then phase 3, that's when we really compare it against the standard of care. If we know, okay, well, we give this drug, the phase 3 trial may say, can we give this drug instead, or can we add this drug to what we already give? And we're looking again to see, is it better than the standard of care? Does it add to this? And then from there, it gets submitted to the FDA for drug approval. And sometimes you'll get a phase 4 study, which is kind of a post-marketing study to see, well, look, how does the drug really behave in the real world, kind of more long-term effects. So that's a very, high level overview. I saw something here pop up in the chat about clinical trials in metastatic disease. And, when we think about clinical trials, we can see them in all stages of cancer, both early stage and metastatic.
Okay, thank you. That is a really helpful overview. We have a question about the timing, and this was sort of a two-part question. It's basically how long does it typically take for a new treatment to move from research to being available to patients? And the second part of that I know is that this particular patient was curious. Let's say you missed out for various reasons in joining a clinical trial. And then early on in the data, because sometimes before the trial ends, data is presented at a big show like San Antonio, and they start to see positive data. And if you feel left out that you missed out on that trial, is there a way that you could still get that drug, or how long typically would you have to wait to get access to it?
So this is something that happens a lot. So the first part of that question is, the timing, it can take a long time for a drug to get approved. It can take up to 10 years and sometimes even longer from that original drug discovery to FDA approval. Now, once something starts in humans, a lot of it depends too on, the population that it's testing. How quickly can that study accrue, right? If they're hoping to accrue let's say 5,000 patients, well, how quickly can they get those patients onto the study? And then what are they what is their endpoint? So if they're looking to see, when all trials are developed, they have these interim analyses where they say, okay, we've given people these drugs, we're going to check in at 6 months, or we're going to check it at 9 months, and sometimes it's longer. So depending on how the study is designed and what their endpoint is, can kind of guide, is it going to be a shorter approval or a longer approval? In terms of, this happens all the time, people miss out on a study, and they can miss out on a study for a number of reasons. It's not available where they're being treated. Sometimes we see this all the time, you have to be within, let's say, 12 months of your surgery, and now you're 13 months, right? And you just missed the window. And unfortunately, there's not really a good way to get that drug unless it's FDA approved. Sometimes, if the data is very compelling, and we've seen this with some breast cancer drugs recently, we can get them approved by the insurance even without an FDA approval. That's rare, but sometimes we can do that. And otherwise, sometimes, again, if the data is very compelling, sometimes the company will release it for compassionate use. A lot of it really depends on, is this drug already approved for something else, right? So where we saw this, I'll give you an example, was Keytruda for triple negative breast cancer. So the data came out that it was really compelling for stage 2 and stage 3 triple negative breast cancer with pembrolizumab and neoadjuvant chemo, and it wasn't yet approved. But because Keytruda was approved for so many other things in the cancer space, we were able to get it for some patients even without that specific FDA approval. If a drug doesn't have any FDA approval in that disease type, it's a little bit harder to get it. So it really depends. If you've missed out on a trial, I would urge people to go to clinicaltrials.gov. Sometimes there are additional trials recruiting for that drug, and really talking to your oncologist about, is this something, how does this impact me? But it can be very hard if someone missed out on something. I will say that if the data, if the drug is like these interim safety analyses and efficacy analyses are presented, all of the trials, when they're written, have these hard stops for which, if the data is so compelling, they will move forward. Like, the FDA does not want to withhold drugs from patients if the efficacy is so strong. And on the flip side, they actually will terminate studies if the pre-specified analyses don't meet the endpoints. So, that sometimes can change the timing of the approvals as well.
Okay. That is really encouraging that sometimes it gets fast tracked, or sometimes if it's really the appropriate fit for a certain patient scenario, that there are situations where that can get approved. I also think that's really great advice to look if there was one trial that had a specific drug you were interested in, to see if there are other trials for the same drug. Also, maybe a similar class of drugs. So I guess I'm thinking like CDK4/6 inhibitors, where there's three different ones, and maybe you didn't get on a trial for a certain one, but there are other options that are technically a different drug, but the same class of drug, if that's the right way to say that.
Exactly. And the FDA does have mechanisms in place for things to expedite approval. So this is called fast track or breakthrough therapy or priority review, which are all designed to get the drug faster to patients if there's a benefit.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Um, so next question on this are about the factors that determine whether a patient is eligible for a clinical trial. And I think this is super broad, but I also think that what they were getting at a bit do you have to be a certain stage or have run out of other options to consider a trial?
So a lot of this really depends on the type of trial and what it's testing. Is it testing a completely novel therapy that's maybe in phase 1, right? In first in human trial. And so usually in those cases, sometimes we do kind of go through what's already approved and has benefit, but not always. For more early stage cancers, a lot of times, like for example, you mentioned the CDK4/6 inhibitor. So that's all of those studies were done adding this class of medication, CDK4/6 inhibitors, for patients who were already on endocrine therapy for hormone receptor positive. So they didn't take away anything, but they added a medication. So a lot of it really depends on the trial, the eligibility criteria, meaning, what kind of disease characteristics and patient characteristics are needed for the study. I will say that you do have to be, your blood work has to be pretty good. You have to be relatively fit in the sense of, we want to be kind of look at this by performance status, meaning, how much time is someone spending out of bed versus in bed. So typically patients who are pretty sick, not getting out of bed, sometimes they're not eligible for a clinical trial. So the population does tend to be fairly selective for each trial, but it differs, again, based on the study design and the investigational drug.
Okay. We're getting some live questions about specific trials for specific cancer types. So like lobular cancer in the metastatic setting, but maybe at a higher level, the question is your opinion on the most promising areas of research or trials that are happening right now in metastatic breast cancer.
So, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot happening in each disease type, right? There's different drugs in each disease type. We're seeing in hormone receptor positive a lot of studies on more novel endocrine agents. So SERDs and PROTACs and all these different ways that are targeting the estrogen receptor. For triple negative and HER2 positive, they're looking at different antibody drug conjugates. And so many different things that are happening. There are studies specifically for lobular. I mean, there's all different things. The Lobular Breast Cancer Alliance is a great place to look at. But clinicaltrials.gov is kind of your go-to to look for trials. And it's not the easiest website to navigate, but you can put in there, all right, I'm looking for lobular and stage 4, and I'm in New York. And it'll kind of tell you what's in that area. And it has contact information for the clinical trial site. So you can call them and say, oh, I found this trial and I'm interested in it, and they can go through with you whether you'd be eligible or not. So it's a great way to start. And you can take that information to your oncologist too and say, I found this. What do you think? There are some exciting vaccine trials that are ongoing. So, I mean, there's just so much happening, but that website's a great place to go.
Okay. That sounds like a good resource. I think that leads us in a bit to there's several questions about specific trials or specific drugs that patients in our community have been curious about.
Mhm.
I'd like to start with SERDs.
Yeah.
You just mentioned them, and
Mhm.
I think there's just an overall curiosity about how this fits in with the aromatase inhibitors and tamoxifen and like those class of endocrine therapies that we might be more familiar with, and then how those are currently being used in the metastatic setting. And I believe there's trials looking at them in the early stage setting.
Absolutely. So SERDs stand for selective estrogen receptor degrader. So think about it this way: anastrozole or aromatase inhibitor, so letrozole, exemestane, what they do is they block production of estrogen in the body. Now, you have to be in menopause to be on an aromatase inhibitor because it blocks estrogen production everywhere but the ovaries. But they put people into a very low estrogen state because they're essentially depleting you of estrogen. So this is where we run into a lot of the side effects that people experience: the hot flashes, vaginal dryness, joint pain, cognitive function, and so bone health issues and so forth. Tamoxifen doesn't do that. It doesn't block estrogen production, but it takes the estrogen that's already in your body and doesn't allow it to bind to a breast cancer cell that has the estrogen receptor. SERDs are different. They're really looking at degrading the estrogen receptor. So they're not getting rid of the level of estrogen in your body, but they're degrading the receptor so that the estrogen that's floating around can't find a home in the receptor. So if you think of estrogen and the estrogen receptor kind of like a key in a lock situation, there's no lock. So there's nothing for that key to it just kind of floats around. A SERD that we're all familiar with is Faslodex or fulvestrant, which we use in metastatic disease. But these are kind of next generation SERDs. A lot of them are oral medications, and they're being studied both in metastatic disease, where we already have an approval with a SERD called elacestrant or Ursodiol, which is approved for patients with metastatic disease that are hormone receptor positive that have an ESR1 mutation. That mutation kind of can tell us that they maybe develop some resistance to an aromatase inhibitor, and we can switch to the elacestrant. There are a number of SERDs being looked at for early stage breast cancer to see, are they better than the aromatase inhibitors? And also, are they less toxic? Do they have less side effects? Those trials are going to take some time. We're not looking at 6 to 9 months here. I mean, I think the SERDs in early stage disease is going to be several years, but there's camizestrant, there's illuminesestrant. I mean, there's a lot of them. And this is a great example of what you were talking about, Suzanne. Well, maybe you didn't get onto the camizestrant study, but you can get onto, the other SERD study. And I think, I've been getting a lot of questions recently. Well, which SERD is better and which study should I do? And we don't know. I mean, clinical trials are attempting to answer this question. We don't know what is going to pan itself out. So lots happening. There's a lot of targets targeting the estrogen receptor kind of in a novel way. And hopefully that will improve side effects as well.
Okay. So this question, I think, goes along with this perfectly. I'm trying to make sure I understand it. With the ESR1 mutation, and then you said that the SERD or Orserdu is the one that's approved in the metastatic setting right now, could be indicated in that situation. Is that different than a hormone positive breast cancer losing its estrogen signaling when it progresses?
That's a little bit different.
Okay.
What can happen is tumors can change or they can mutate. And so the receptors that they had no longer, they're different. So sometimes a cancer really fed on estrogen and it starts to lose that estrogen receptor and it no longer feeds on estrogen. So you can think of, again, the keys or the locks have changed, right? So the key that you were fitting in, well, the lock is different now, so your key doesn't fit into that lock. So that's why a lot of times when someone has had early stage breast cancer and they've developed a recurrence or progression, we actually will rebiopsy it because we want to make sure that these markers, these receptors haven't changed so that we're targeting, we know exactly what we're targeting. So with ESR1, that's a mutation the tumor can acquire, but it hasn't changed its hormone receptor status. But this kind of falls again into this whole category of biomarkers and molecular testing. And really, all breast cancers are so unique. And so as we think about treatment, we're making sure, okay, we've got our ER, we've got our PR, we've got HER2. Now we also have in metastatic disease, we're looking for ESR1 and PIK3CA and AKT and PTEN and all of these things. And that's looking at mutations and changes in the tumor. Some patients inherit a mutation like the BRCA mutation, that's in their blood, germline mutation that's in all of their DNA. And we do have drugs to target that as well. So when we think about genetic testing, we're thinking, individual germline, something that's in all our cells, but then also tumor testing.
Yes. For everybody listening, because I know that that was a lot, we did a previous webinar. If you look in our app or on the website about the difference in genetic and genomic testing and how that can match up to different therapy options. And I know that that's what Dr. Toplinsky was just getting at there. But I also know it can be from firsthand knowledge really overwhelming and
It is.
confusing.
I mean, it's a whole other topic.
Yes.
There's just so much, and that's just kind of highlights, right, the complexities of treating breast cancer nowadays.
Yes, 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 the complexities, but also just the opportunity and the hope in
Yeah.
precision medicine and having so many things available to us. Uh, there was the question that came in. Let me see if you have something to add to this, but she wanted to know if there was anything in the works specifically for an ATM mutation.
Well, I mean, nothing that I'm aware of the top of my head, but there are so many um, drug discovery and preclinical and clinical research ongoing that there may be something, in the works. I think, obviously everyone who has a genetic mutation, right? With BRCA, if you have a BRCA mutation, we can give Lynparza. And so, of course, for other mutations, we're thinking, well, what can we give, right? And there is research ongoing, but nothing at this time for ATM or CHEK2 specifically to target that. But that does not mean that there won't be something in the future.
Right. Okay. How about any new treatments on the horizon for HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer? And specifically, so that one just in general, and then specifically if you have brain metastasis with that.
I mean, HER2 has had such a revolution in the last few years with drugs like trastuzumab deruxtecan, which is now actually approved for HER2 positive and HER2 low. Other drugs like tucatinib and capecitabine from the HER2 Climb series of trials. And so those really have changed prognosis and have changed treatment significantly. And a lot of them are active in metastatic disease as well. There's a lot of research going into brain metastases and, what crosses the blood-brain barrier and how can we, what kind of research can we do? And I think a lot of it, we have all these drugs now, we're still trying to figure out, well, all right, what do we do first? What do we do second? What do we do third? And how does that impact? There are some trastuzumab deruxtecan is a type of medication called an antibody drug conjugate. And there's some newer antibody drug conjugates that are being researched that hopefully will be an option again in the future. So lots happening in that space.
Okay. We've addressed before questions about Signatera, that kind of test. And in the questions in the early stage setting, I know that we've pretty consistently had expert oncologists tell us that they're not routinely using it yet in early stage. We're not sure what to do with a positive result. But is it a test that you use in the metastatic setting to sort of monitor response to treatment?
So it can be, Signatera, for those who may not be familiar, the 10-second answer is that all of our cells shed DNA into the bloodstream, and so can our cancer cells. So you can use Signatera to kind of get a sense of what are we, what are we seeing, right? Are there cancer cells floating around that are shedding their DNA? And so there's a lot of excitement about using Signatera to identify a recurrence or who may be at risk for recurrence, but we don't use it routinely in early stage because we don't know what to do with the results. And just like you said, if it's positive, well, we know that someone may recur in a year or 2 years, but we can't modify that at this point. So there's a lot of research going into, can we change the trajectory? Can we make a positive Signatera negative, right? So until we get there, that's where things are heading. Now, in metastatic disease, I don't routinely use it for everyone. It may have some utility if someone doesn't make your typical tumor marker like a CA2729 or a CA15-3 that we can monitor. So it can be helpful in some patients, but it's not something that we're using for everyone at this
time. Okay. That's sort of asked in the context of just, somebody who's living and thriving with metastatic disease for a long time and just hoping to find alternatives to not having to be scanned so often.
Yeah, unfortunately, nothing is going to replace scans.
Scans yet.
Maybe, hopefully I get it. I mean, scans are such a burden and they're hard and it's radiation exposure. But I don't think we're there at any time soon about replacing scans for a blood test.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I want to clarify. So somebody asked the question when I'm talking about early stage, is that considered anything other than stage 4 metastatic disease? And yes, the context that I'm using it when I say early stage, that is the context in which I am using it. Okay, I would love to move into some survivorship and living with metastatic breast cancer questions, sort of lifestyle and side effect type questions. When we sent out our last call for questions, I ended up getting several about sexual side effects and specifically using vaginal estrogen. So I wanted to just spend some time on that because I know that that is something that a lot of women in both the early stage and the metastatic setting are struggling with. And somebody just popped up and said, not necessarily just for sexual side effects, but also for just UTIs and just generally kind of being uncomfortable. So
yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, and I'm so glad that we're talking about it. I'm so glad there's more attention being paid about it because for so long people were suffering and just didn't have any options or people weren't talking about it. So vaginal dryness, can result is very common. First of all, it's common in people who've gone through menopause, people who've gone through premature menopause as a result of treatment, people who've are in a lower estrogen state, from the endocrine therapies. And what happens when it's dry, you can it can make obviously it can cause painful sex, but that the vaginal mucosa gets very very dry, very fragile. It's uncomfortable, it can be painful, it can put people at risk for urinary tract infections. And, a UTI, I mean, I see people who haven't had a UTI in decades and now they're coming in and they said, I've had 4 UTIs in 6 months. And a lot of it just because of all that dryness, it makes everything prone to risk for infection. So what can we do? There are lots of options. There are non-hormonal options that are vaginal moisturizers. We like ones that are hyaluronic acid based, and you can use those several times per week, and that can be very helpful for patients where it does not help. Vaginal estrogen is a great option. Vaginal estrogen, is per all of the guidelines, it's a great option, especially for people who've not had a good response to the non-hormonal vaginal moisturizers. And it doesn't get absorbed into the circulation. So when they've monitored estrogen levels in the blood, they haven't seen a bump from people using vaginal estrogen. There are creams, there are rings, and there are tablets. And so a lot of that is just preference. I like either the creams or the tablets. I kind of like the cream because you can put it externally as well. And so around the urethra and kind of lubricate that area. But the creams can be messy. So some people like the tablets. And so, either any of them are fine. And that can be very helpful. Now, one of the things that we see a lot in survivorship, and especially in the AYA population, is low libido or no libido. And I see someone brought that up here. And treating the vaginal estrogen, by treating the vaginal dryness doesn't necessarily fix the libido, but if it makes sexual activity a little less painful, sometimes for some people that can be helpful. Now, when we think about low libido, it's for so many reasons. It could be the biological reasons of the vaginal dryness and premature menopause. There's a psychiatric or mental health component, right, of the impact of body image and anxiety and depression in some people, and just the changes that have happened as a result of a diagnosis. And then the social part, which is sometimes, patients will say, my partner is afraid to touch me, or they don't want to hurt me, and it creates a lot of uncertainty. So all of these things play a role. There are some medications, such as Addyi or flibanserin, that could be an option for hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And I really recommend working with a sexual therapist. That can be helpful for some people, seeing their gynecologist, making sure you're getting your pelvic exam. But there are things that we can do. And I hope that people are, getting professional, they're talking to their doctors and they're not being dismissed, because it's a really important topic for many reasons.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's huge for quality of life. And I'm so glad that the vaginal estrogen, just as you said, is being talked about more. And I just want to clarify, because I have had a lot of these conversations, that vaginal estrogen is different than hormone replacement therapy, where you like get a patch, because that can be systematically absorbed. And I know that there are great doctors looking into maybe even that being safe for breast cancer survivors in the future. But as of right now, I don't think it's routinely given the thumbs up. But those are two separate things, and vaginal estrogen for sure is safe.
Yes, 100%. And all of the guidelines say that. And I think sometimes what I hear a lot is people are being told, my doctor said I can't use vaginal estrogen. And I think if that's happening, I think it's okay to open up that dialogue and say, but here are the ASCO guidelines, and here are the ACOG and the NAMS guidelines, all these guidelines that say that breast cancer patients, especially if the non-hormonal moisturizers are not helpful, that vaginal estrogen can be a discussion. There's data that tells us that it's safe. So I think it's okay to push back a little bit and say, but here are the guidelines, and can we talk about why, I'm being told I can't take it. Very different than hormone replacement therapy. And then the systemic hormone replacement therapy very much depends. Are you triple negative, and are you hormone receptor positive or ER negative, right? That's a much bigger.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Some more lifestyle ones. This made me laugh because I've actually thought this one myself. Not that it's necessarily funny, but it's just being a cancer survivor can be really overwhelming. So cancer is stressful, and I often come across articles that say stress is a contributing factor to cancer outcomes, which makes me more stressed. What is the actual connection between cancer progressing and stress?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And it's true, right? Of course, you're reading this and you're already stressed and you're like, well, I give up, right? What can you do? So no one knows. I think how I like to think about it is, of course, it's stressful. There's so many stressors that are thrown at patients time and time again in cancer diagnosis and treatment. They just keep coming. And you can't control those stressors. You just can't, right? I mean, you have zero control over that. But what we can try to control is the response to stressors, and how do we do that? And some of those things are leaning into those healthy habits, and ways to cope with mental health. And there are great tools for that. And we talk a lot about making sure that you are taking care of your mental health, whether that be through seeing a therapist, whether that be through support groups, medications, journaling, meditation, ways that, I always talk to patients of what's in your toolkit about coping with these things. The data really isn't great. We don't have any real good data that, stress causes breast cancer recurrence or progression. We just don't. It's been a big topic that's talked about, but I think a lot of stress, can lead to inflammation in the body. And I think part of it is too, is if we're very stressed, does it lead to unhealthier habits, right? Which we know can play a role. But I want to be very, very clear that there is not one thing that will cause a recurrence, and it's not anyone's fault. I think sometimes when people recur or they develop breast cancer, they progress, they feel like, oh my God, is it something that I did? And it's not. The first thing I say to people, it's not your fault. You did not do this. You did not contribute to this. Because, even if we know things may increase the risk of cancer, there's plenty of people who do those things and do not get cancer, right? So we really still don't understand, why does someone get diagnosed with cancer or have a recurrence, and why does someone not? So we can lean into the things we know are helpful, but they're not the end all be all.
Yes, that is very helpful. Question along those same lines is about weight, because this is a big one, because we do hear how maintaining a healthy weight is important, but treatments and steroids and menopause are all really hard for maintaining a healthy weight. So this member of our community said, I've gained so much weight from treatment. How important is maintaining a healthy weight and reducing my recurrence risk?
Yeah. And talk about stress, right? Talk about things that
Yeah.
can lead to stress. And you are, yes, when you've gained weight from treatment, when you're in menopause and you even look at a cookie, right? And you feel like, oh my gosh, the scale is creeping up a little bit. And so I like to focus less on the number on the scale, but what are the things that you're doing to take care of your body? Because so much of it, the number is sometimes really just not in your control. So if someone comes to me and they say, look, I'm exercising, I'm moving my body on a regular basis, I'm eating protein and healthy fats, I'm limiting the processed sugars and I'm limiting alcohol use, I think that that's what matters more than the number on the scale. Because, and that's something that you can control and you can focus on, right? Because sometimes there is going to be some weight gain during treatment that it's really sometimes hard to come back to that because the body has changed. It has changed after all these treatments. It has changed with the hormone levels, with menopause. And so you may not be able to get back to the number you were on the scale, but that number doesn't define people. I care more about what we're doing in terms of the healthier habits, because I think that's where we can intervene. And that makes the difference because we see people who, maybe are at a healthy weight based on their BMI, but they're not exercising, they're not eating the healthier foods, they're drinking a lot of alcohol, and that's going to be risky as well.
Okay. Thank you. So this one I really want you to address, because I get frustrated because I think there's so much misinformation and disinformation and no shortage of people who will take advantage of vulnerable cancer patients. But it's around supplements and vitamins. And this specific community question was, are there supplements or vitamins that are recommended for metastatic breast cancer patients to support our health while we're on all of this treatment? Um, I know my oncologist recommended this like sub website from Memorial Sloan Kettering, where you can put in the name of the supplement or the herb, and then it gives you kind of their opinion on that and any drug interaction. So I don't know, where's a safe place for us?
Well, I think that's so the MSK Memorial Sloan Kettering About Herbs website is excellent. It is always updated. They've got the up-to-date data, and you can put in this and it'll say yes, or this is what you should watch out for. Always check with your oncologist because what that website doesn't do, it takes into account what else you're taking. So we want to make sure that there are no interactions. But I agree with you. Social media will have you believe that if there are miracle cures and if you spend thousands of dollars and you get a cancer coach that will teach you about these supplements, that you're going to be good to go. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. So I always like to think about, really, I focus on getting as much as you can through your diet. Vitamin D is a supplement that can be very helpful. And some people, if they're low in something, then yes, if they're, eating more of a plant-based or vegan diet, then B supplements going to be helpful, right? These are individual things, but there's no one or two magic supplements that everyone should be taking. Maybe except the vitamin D, which can be useful, but that are going to help. I think really sitting down and talking with your medical team about what should I be doing, but really you don't need a lot of supplements. I think and what's being sold when you think about what you're buying on the internet and who's selling them to you, always look at who it is, right? Is it someone who is marketing these supplements because they need them and they're getting paid for them? Are they on the board of that web? I mean, like you want to trace the data because I think there's a lot of that happening on social media. People may be getting paid because you bought this supplement.
Yes, very good advice and just important. Okay, I have a couple of exercise related questions. And I know this is like close to your heart and you've got a lot of good advice here. So the first one, do we have any research that shows if regular physical activity affects the progression of metastatic breast cancer? But maybe you can also just talk like kind of in general about risk reduction and exercise studies.
So exercise is the one thing that actually really lowers our risk. You know, all these other things, drinking alcohol and maybe the diet, they can increase your risk, but exercise lowers your risk, and it lowers your risk of recurrence, lowers your risk of disease progression. Plus, it helps you feel better as you move. Now, you know, the challenge is if you don't feel great, if you're faced with neuropathy and fatigue and joint pain, and here I am saying, well, 150 minutes a week, you're not doing that, right? Like, again, talk about stress. And so I think starting small, and that can mean a 5 minute walk to your mailbox and back. Maybe that you walk down the block and back. It doesn't have to be the 150 minutes, right? More is better. But if you're not doing that, you got to build and work your way up to that. And for some people, I love things like chair yoga, something very gentle. There's a lot of great resources out there about starting slow. It may be even picking up 1 pound weights or walking with ankle weights, swimming in a pool, physical therapy, especially in the metastatic disease, physical therapy when you're on treatment and long term and have all these side effects. PT can be great at starting to do the stretching and everything. So start slow, but any movement is better than no movement.
Okay. Um, so then a specific kind of side effect from treatment, and I think that you might say that exercise can help with this, but if there's any way to avoid or maybe push off for as long as possible osteopenia or osteoporosis when having to be on endocrine therapy, possibly for life.
I mean, 100% exercise, but specifically here, we're talking about weight bearing activity. Um, so you want something that, walking is great. And this is where I love walking with the ankle weights because, or some people will do the weighted vests, you just put them on. So that doesn't require, you're not talking about Olympic weightlifting here, but you're walking with some extra weight on you. And that really can be helpful. So I love even weight bearing activity things like so walking, maybe body weight exercises, squats and lunges, lifting weights can be helpful as well. But exercise number one, of course, making sure that calcium and vitamin D level are good. But really, the more weight bearing activity that someone can do, the better.
Okay. Yeah, and that's nice just to clarify, it doesn't mean getting into the gym necessarily and lifting like heavy weights. It's just even a walk if you do something as simple as putting on ankle weights
And
or
I will say too is that just because you're on endocrine therapy for life or for 10 years or whatever, 5 years, whatever it is, you're not doomed to definitively have osteoporosis. So I think there's been a little bit of a narrative, especially in social media recently, where people are saying if you don't have HRT, you're gonna have you're gonna have osteoporosis, and now you're on these meds and you can't have HRT. And that's not necessarily true. I can tell you, I see people every single day in my clinic who are on these aromatase inhibitors, who've been on them for years, and they have managed to reverse their bone density, not even just stabilize it, but reverse it from osteoporosis with exercise. So and of course, there are also medications. We didn't talk about that, but there are bone modifying medications that we can use in certain cases as well, like Prolia or Reclass or Zometa.
okay. Yes. Could you just because we have a couple, we've buttoned up most of our questions, but since we do have a couple of more minutes, could you just explain for people who aren't aware of that class of drugs? Because I know that sometimes they're used even before there's bone density issues in the early stage setting to
Yeah,
possibly reduce risk of recurrence. If you could just explain that class of drugs and how they're used.
exactly. So we've got this class of bone medications, right? So people know Prolia, we've got Zometa, we Reclass, it's Xgeva if you have metastatic disease, and we think about them in two different ways. So for early stage, you can use them because you have osteopenia or osteoporosis and you want to improve your bone density, or because you want to reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence in the bone. And we use those medications, especially for patients who you have to be postmenopausal and you have to be at kind of, we think about it, people who are at higher risk for recurrence. Those medications do have some side effects. So we think about them on an individual basis. And there's a number of calculators that we can use to say, what's the percent and how much will you benefit from them? So I use them in some patients. I don't use them in everyone for that reason. In the metastatic setting, if you have breast cancer that's progressed to the bone, we definitely want to think about those meds because they can reduce the risk of fracture, number one. And again, that's how we think about them in osteoporosis as well. They can reduce pain if you're having disease in the bone. They can reduce high calcium levels that can come from disease in the bone. And they can reduce progression in the bone. And again, not going to be for everyone, but that's something for metastatic disease, where especially metastatic disease that is already in the bone, we're really, really thinking about that.
Okay, thank you. That was a great understanding of those drugs. And I want to go back to a comment that you made where you said, because HRT and the menopause discussion is having such a moment on social media, when we're thinking specifically about breast cancer survivors and thrivers, it can feel a little daunting because the messaging is you will get osteopenia, you will get dementia, you will get heart disease. And that's not if you can't take HRT. And that's just not necessarily true as a blanket statement.
Exactly. I mean, I do a lot of survivorship in my clinic, and what I love to see the most is people thriving on medications, and they're coming in and they're telling me, okay, my daughter's getting married, and I've got this trip coming up and that trip coming up, and they're doing amazingly, and they've never been on HRT. And so I think that yes, there is menopause is having a moment, and it's important. I'm so glad we're talking about women's health. I
Me
think
too.
so glad we're talking about it. But
Yes.
an HRT is going to be right for maybe some people, but it's not this end all be all. And I really want to change that narrative that you have to have it. Because I feel like that's sometimes what people are seeing right now. And there's so many ways to live a healthy and thriving life without it. And I will tell you the true experts, when they talk about it, when you read their books, in those books, it's always this conversation of, well, other ways that you can focus on your heart and your bones and your brain without HRT. And those there's so many good ways to do that. And it comes back to exercise and diet and all of these lifestyle things. Suzanne, there's a question here about alcohol. Can we talk about?
Yes, I was gonna ask you that next because I was surprised we didn't get more because we usually do on alcohol. So I would love if you addressed this one. Do you want me to read it for
No,
the?
I can talk. We think alcohol and cancer in general. So actually, there's something that I think just came out in the New York Times that I have to look at. But bottom line is alcohol, we know alcohol is a carcinogen. It is classified as a World Health Organization class 1 carcinogen. And we know it increases not just the risk of breast cancers, but many cancers. And so we try to think about limiting alcohol use. I don't talk about completely eliminating it if it's something that people enjoy, but we focus on about 3 drinks per week on average or less. Some people make the decision to completely stop drinking, and that's a personal choice, of course. And what I'm happy to see is that there's so many more mocktails and non-alcoholic beverages at restaurants and bars, and so people still feel like they're part of the social, environment, and they can have something to hold, but it's not alcohol. And alcohol increases cancer risk by a number of different mechanisms. But I think what we see, especially in survivors and thrivers, is it's also going to play an impact. We're thinking about weight, and we're thinking about sleep, and we're thinking about all of these things. It can impact negatively as well. So sometimes people come to me and they say, oh, I'm not sleeping and I've gained some weight. The first thing I say is go, cut out alcohol completely. Do 1 or 2 months, it's dry months, and see how you feel. And a lot of times people come back and they say, I'm sleeping better and I'm moving better, and I feel better. So that's a big thing to think about.
Yes, yes, thank you. Um, so we could take one more if you want to address the last one that popped up. If not, we'll follow up one-on-one.
I think there's something about soy. You want to do a soy? I'm looking at there's the Q&A. There's also a webinar chat.
Yes, I was looking at the last one in the Q&A.
The cannabis
Yeah.
one. Yeah. I can do both super fast.
Okay. I
So
mean,
cannabis, actually, ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, just put out a guideline about cannabis use, and so that's a great thing for patients to reference because I think they actually have a patient like little summary that you can look at. Um, but I think it can be helpful in certain situations, especially for managing things like fatigue in certain cases, sleep, joint pain. But I would check out that guideline because they really go through what the evidence is and what we can do. Now, and in terms of like products and all of that. In terms of the question was if I end up consuming soy by mistake via oil. So soy is minimally processed soy is actually good for us. It has a protective effect. So this is your tofu and edamame and miso. What we want to stay away from is that heavily processed soy, like the soy protein isolates and things like that. But it's not this again all or nothing. If you have a little bit of processed soy, that's okay. We just want to avoid that kind of on a frequent basis.
is soy milk considered processed?
So it's kind of in that minimally to moderately processed category, but you want to look at what's in that soy milk. I always like to look at the ingredients, right? Because there are some soy milks that have like a ton of stuff added to it, which would move it up in that processed category. Where we're thinking processed is like you look at the frozen food and it says plant-based and it's like soy nuggets, right? And you look and it's just really heavily, there's something good in there. I like the tofu, soybeans, miso, and edamame, things like that.
One thing that surprised me is looking, as I've tried to take better care of myself after diagnosis and make better healthy eating choices. The milks, the milk alternatives, the ones that have the lesser ingredients, which are the ones that are better for you, tend to be the ones that are not in the refrigerated section. And have you noticed that? And then like the soy milks that are in the refrigerated section tend to be the ones that have 15 ingredients.
Yeah, and I think, that's a big dairy, such a controversy, right? Do we need the dairy alternatives? Can we have dairy? And the verdict's really out on this one in terms of breast cancer and dairy. I think everything in moderation. I think what some of the dairy alternative milks have a lot of added sugar. And so we're always looking at that as well. And I mean, ultimately, I'll tell you, look, it's just impossible to eat a completely clean, no processed food diet. And so I think aiming for that is probably unrealistic, but thinking about what am I doing 75, 80, 85% of the time, and how do I feel after I put these foods in my body? Do I feel good? Do I feel like they're fueling me? And then once in a while, it's okay. It's okay to have that cake or that donut. That's fine. That is not going to cause your cancer to come back. It's just not.
Okay, perfect. I would love to, this may be kind of putting you on the spot, but to end this part of our conversation, is there anyone on social media, like a registered dietitian or an oncology nutritionist, that you feel is a good person to follow for this kind of advice?
So I'll actually plug the dietitian at our cancer center in San Diego.
Okay.
We hired her because we love her and love the work that she's doing. So Jessica Cording is her name. She's a registered dietitian. She does actually on our hospital website, Valley Breast Center does cooking demos for our breast cancer population once a month, and has all her recipes there. And she's really focused on moderation and plant-based eating. So she's definitely a go-to person. There's a lot of people. There is another, I will give you her name right now because I love her also. And she's actually a breast cancer survivor, Allison Tierney. She's wholesome.cancer.nutrition. She's awesome and she does so much great work on there as well.
Okay. I
That's
mean,
not inclusive. There's so many other wonderful
yes.
people, but these are just the two that come to mind.
Yes, yes, we appreciate that, and we'll write those up in the transcript and kind of the blog post summary of this event afterwards, so that everybody has access to that. I think that's all we have time for today. If I didn't get to your question, it likely could be that it was just a little bit too specific or kind of asking for specific medical advice. And so we will have one of our oncology nurse practitioners follow up with you one-on-one to make sure that your question does get addressed. But for everyone else, thank you so much, Dr. Teplinsky. This was incredibly helpful. We really appreciate you and your time, your heart for patients. Again, if you don't already follow her, you should follow Dr. Teplinsky on Instagram. She's just a wealth of information and hope to all of us. If you have additional questions that you would just like answered from us, you can email us at questions@outcomesforme.com or in the Ask Now question box within the app. And we will make a recording of this webinar if you want to go back and revisit it, available in the app or to share with other survivors and thrivers. So thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Teplinsky, and I hope you have an awesome evening.
Thank you, everyone. This was so wonderful. It flew by, full hour.
It did. Oh my gosh, I know.
Do it again.
Yeah, it was super fun. We would love to have you back again. So,
thank you, everyone.
all right, bye-bye.